Benazir Bhutto, Chapter 7. Bhutto, like her foe Jia, but discovering that American support was all important to her political career, if not her very survival. Her father had designed her trajectory so that she might acquire the right connections as well as the right education, and these efforts now began to pay off, particularly in the person of Peter Galbraith, who had risen steadily in the Washington establishment since his years at Harvard and Oxford. Galbraith had received a law degree from Georgetown after leaving Oxford, and in 1979 he took a staff job on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where he handled Near Eastern and South Asian affairs. He had maintained contact with Benazir and now observed for her situation with concern. In Washington, he and his mentor, Senator Claiborne Pell, persistently reminded her, their colleagues, of the Bhutto woman's plight at the hands of the American client Jia, and lobbied on their behalf with various influential senators and congressmen. Beginning in 1981, Galbraith sought meetings with Benazir herself, but this possibility was denied by Pakistan's military authorities. It was also most strenuously discouraged by the Reagan administration, which had ruled that no US government personnel were allowed to have contact with any member of the Bhutto family. Jia was too important to Reagan's grand plan in Afghanistan. Galbraith and Nusrat Bhutto flouted this injunction when they met in Pakistan that year. Nusrat chose one of the most public meeting spots she could think of, the Karachi Boat Club, as a gesture of defiance. Jia's 1982 visit to Washington was in most aspects a love fest. A Reagan wrote in his diary, "We got along fine. He is a good man. Cavalry gave me his word they were not building an atomic or nuclear bomb. He is dedicated to helping the Afghans and stopping the Soviets." But Pell and Galbraith managed to remind the members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who met with Jia, that the general was not such a good man after all. Pell specifically brought up Jia's treatment of the Bhutto woman, and Jia defended his actions, claiming that in fact Benazir lived in comfort and had easy access to the telephone. "Senator, she lives in a better house than any of you senators. She can use the phone and friends can visit her." Immediately then I went out and called. Galbraith comments, "And of course they would not let me speak to her." Galbraith admits to having finalized a deal that would enable him to meet with Benazir. The Reagan administration was keen to appoint Dean Hinton as US ambassador to Pakistan, but he had been a long-time CIA officer, and the Senate hearing process promised to drag out for a long time and to be embarrassing for all parties. Galbraith negotiated a quid pro quo whereby Hinton's confirmation would be pushed through the Senate without a hearing if, once he was ensconced in Islamabad, Hinton would help arrange a meeting between Galbraith and Benazir. Hinton duly departed for Pakistan in November 1983. Galbraith arrived there on January 9, 1984, but to his surprise, he discovered that Benazir had just been put on a plane headed for Europe and medical treatment. Jia's administration had decided to cut its losses and not risk further embarrassment over its treatment of the Bhutto ladies. Besides, as Galbraith points out, if she had died either of illness or in mysterious circumstances on the operating table, Jia's aid package might have been in real trouble. The Americans' decisive intervention had possibly saved Benazir's life. In London, she was reunited with her family at an aunt's Knightsbridge flat. She underwent microscopic surgery on her mastoid at the end of month and could then, in theory, go back to resume her struggle in Pakistan. According to her autobiography, she decided to stay in London instead because she would be required to have another operation in 9 to 12 months' time. She may perhaps have had some need to defend her decision to leave Pakistan after having doggedly hung on there for so long, but no excuse is necessary. She turned out to be far more effective leading the opposition to Jia from London, where she was free to publish, communicate and publicize her cause, than from Karachi where her every move was monitored. Bhutto swung into action in characteristically energetic style, drawing international attention to Jia's horrendous human rights abuses and to the plight of the 40,000 political prisoners languishing in Pakistan's miserable jail. A few days after her arrival in London, she met with Galbraith and rode to Washington after his trip to the subcontinent. He stressed the importance of American backing for the masses she was trying to get across and for her future political career. If she was to have one, Reagan and the Afghanistan hawks would have preferred to ignore Benazir and the Bhutto family entirely, but other lawmakers were concerned with Jia's human rights record and might be eager to talk to her. You need to come to the United States, Galbraith asked Benazir. Because basically, the Reagan administration thinks you are a pro-communist sympathizer against the US, cause in Afghanistan, a radical, and they want to have this alliance with Pakistan. You need to be able to persuade them that you will be just as good for them as Jia, except that you will have more popular support. He also tried to help her hone her oratorical style. She was so intense and so I did say, slow down, speak slowly, just have 1 or 2 points. She followed Galbraith's sage advice closely, making a trip to the United States later that year. In New York, she went right to the top of the media heap, setting up a meeting with Time magazine editor Walter Isaacson, another Howard buddy. In Washington, Galbraith put her up at his apartment on Capitol Hill, and while Reagan's White House made no overtures, Galbraith introduced her to as many influential people as he could, including Senators Pell, Charles Matthews, E.D. Jasinski, Alan Cranston, Paul Tsongas, Edward Kennedy, and Charles Percy, and Congressman Stephen Solarz. He also introduced her to a lawyer named Mark Siegel, who became her unofficial American lobbyist during these years and her official one after she came to power. From this time on, Siegel would be a powerful force in packaging Benazir for an American audience. Later, he would collaborate with her on her posthumously published 2008 book, Reconciliation, Islam, Democracy and the West, and he would update her autobiography after her death, adding a final chapter and epilogue. He also produced a staggeringly one-sided biopic about her 3 years after her death, possibly with an eye to the future political career of her son Bilawal. In London, Benazir took a flat at the Barbican Estate, a brutalist apartment block, and there, in relative safety, finally began to regain not only her health but also her once ebullient personality. Catherine Duker, her Oxford friend, recalls the era. Benazir used to organize dinners there. I was always impressed by how well she cooked for a person who always lived with servants. When she came out of arrest, she was in a mildly traumatized state, jumping at sudden noise and worrying about who might be spying on her. I think she chose to live at the Barbican, that great ugly place, for its good security, but I can remember having fun with her in those days, going to Grand Teas at the Savoy, shopping for boots, going to movies. One was Hanif Qureshi's My Beautiful Laundrette. The Barbican flat quickly became the headquarters of PPP members in exile, staffed by Pakistani volunteers. The group continued its campaign to publicize the atrocities committed by the Jia regime and the mistreatment and occasional execution of its political prisoners. It also became the center of an inevitable power struggle within the PPP, an undeclared battle for party leadership. In Banerjee's words, she had been confirmed as acting chairperson of the party by the Central Executive Committee upon her arrival in England. But many of the party's elder statesmen were not at all sure they approved of this choice. Some objected to her inexperience. The not insignificant Marxist contingent worried that she was not sufficiently committed to socialist principles. Most of all, party stalwarts worried that with the accession of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's daughter to the top position, the party would become a Bhutto family fiefdom, a fear that would prove only too well founded. The failure then and later to hold intra-party elections for the leadership of the PPP would ensure that the Bhutto family, with its brand name appear and beyond the grave blessing from its own personal Sahid, would maintain control. Jia, under pressure from his sponsors in the United States, decreed that elections would be held in March 1985. But before that date, he decided to stage a referendum whether the people of Pakistan endorsed the process initiated by General Muhammad Zia-ul-Haq, the President of Pakistan, for bringing the laws of Holy Quran and Sunnah of the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him. As Banerjee, who was watching the proceedings from Britain, wondered how could it lose. A no vote was tantamount to voting against Islam, and a yes vote Jia had announced would confirm his election as president for the next 5 years. To help ensure that the vote would go his way, he said that campaigning for a no vote would be punishable by heavy fines and prison sentences, and also that the army would do the vote counting and that the results would not be liable to challenge by the courts. From London, the PPP in exile urged voters to boycott the vote, the only possible approach they could take, and on referendum day, only 0% of exile XO voters went to the polls. Jia then announced elections for February, which the PPP again advised voters to boycott. They were less successful this time, perhaps because Jia now made boycotting to a crime punishable by imprisonment. But Bhutto could not have been dissatisfied with the outcome of the vote. It demonstrated that the PPP was still the strongest party in the country, despite having been officially outlawed. Jia tried to minimize the damage by making amendments to the constitution, reconfirming his presidency for 5 years. Under American pressure, the land of the free should not be seen funding a military dictator. He agreed to be sworn in a civilian rather than a military president. But as Bhutto later pointed out, Jia was still army chief of staff and dressing occasionally in a long tunic instead of a uniform did not change his stripes. Bhutto returned to America in April, delivering a lecture at Harvard and another at the Council on Foreign Relations. Then she went on to Strasbourg, where she addressed the European Parliament. Her final stop was in Cannes in the south of France, where there was to be a family reunion, the first meeting of the 4 Bhutto siblings since their father's death. Shahnawaz had been living in nearby Nice with his wife Rehana and their little daughter Sasi. Sanam arrived from London and Nusrat from Geneva, where she had been living in exile. Murtaza came from Damascus with his wife Fawzia, Rehana's sister, and their daughter Fatima. Fatima and Sasi were both 3 years old. The family spent several festive days together, although it was clear that Shah and Rehana's marriage was not a happy one. On the night of July 17, there was a celebratory barbecue on the beach at La Negrelle, after which Shah and Murtaza got into separate cars to drive the relative home. But the time the two brothers and their wives had reconvened at Sa's place, it was apparent that Sa and Rehana had quarreled. Murtaza intervened and was kicked out of the apartment by Rehana. Eventually, things seemed to be settling down, with Rehana and Sasi in the bedroom, getting ready to sleep. But the following afternoon, Rehana came to find Murtaza at his mother's bed. Something was the matter with Sa, she said, stopping to call the police. Murtaza hurried back with Rehana to find Sa's body face down on the living room floor. He had been poisoned with a little vial of toxin. He and his brother both kept in case. They were taken by enemies. Poisoned at whose hand, no one knew. The truth about Sa's death was never discovered. He might have killed himself. His marriage was on the rocks and he had been depressed. But no one in the Bhutto family considered it a possibility. Nor would they likely to, for in Muslim societies, suicide carries a stigma. Fawzia, Murtaza's wife, subscribed to the suicide theory, saying that the Bhutto family was too proud to admit that such a thing was possible. However, there was no suicide note, and the timing would have been very odd for a suicide. Newspapers in Pakistan speculated that Sa had died of drug and alcohol abuse. Murtaza believed the resign of the ISI and CIA had engineered a hit, and it is true that the Bhutto brothers constituted a perpetual threat to the current government. Sa and Murtaza had garnered plenty of other enemies too during their years at the helm of Al-Zulfikar, for they had hardly stopped their terrorist activities after the hijacking. Their next target, in fact, had been the Chief Justice who had sentenced Zulfikar Ali Bhutto to death, and though Al-Zulfikar operatives missed him when they opened fire on his car, they had inadvertently succeeded in killing a friend who was with him at the time. The Bhutto brothers had made enemies within Al-Zulfikar, too, for they ruled high-handedly and were extremely careless with the lives of their followers. Fatima Bhutto has expressed her own suspicion that Rehana had something to do with her husband's death. There was no evidence that Rehana had played an active role, but neither can there be any doubt that her behavior at the time was strange. It turned out that Sa had not died instantaneously, and his wife had certainly taken her time before seeking help. In Rehana's first testimony, Fatima writes, there is a suggestion that she did not help Sa as he lay dying, but a clear assertion that she did not kill him. The French police too thought Rehana's behavior suspicious, and she was detained and temporarily imprisoned in Nice before being released for lack of evidence. According to Peter Galbraith, Banerjee's personal belief was that Rehana had killed her boys with toys. Galbraith said they had poisons that were provided by the Syrian secret services. That's what Banerjee thought. In any case, Banerjee and Murtaza filed a case against Rehana in France, citing the Good Samaritan laws. By this time, Rehana was in California with her family in France, to which she did not return. She was convicted in absentia for not coming to the aid of a dying man. Banerjee speculated openly and pointedly about how she had obtained a US visa. Sa's death was a sad one, but not terribly surprising considering his life path. Banerjee, with her heightened sense of her family's quasi-divine status and her unorthodox interpretation of Islam, presented it as suffocating tragedy, the immutable workings of destiny. Many in Pakistan have come to believe that the victimization of the Bhutto family and our supporters was the Karbala of our generation. The father was not spared, the mother was not spared, the brothers were not spared, the daughters was not spared, the band of followers were not spared. Yet, like the followers of the Prophet's grandson, our resolves never faltered. One might dismiss this as pure rhetoric, a cynical manipulation of Pakistani religious sensibilities. but it was written for a Western audience and with a straight face. Can she really have taken herself and her all too human family this seriously? If so, what does it say about her ability to lead in a genuinely democratic spirit? 5 days after burying her brother and now back in Karachi, Bhutto was arrested again, charged with visiting terrorists in sensitive areas. The regime must have been made nervous by the large crowds of supporters she had attracted since her arrival in the country, and she was now issued a 90 days detention order at 70 Clifton, temporarily deemed a sub-jail. Thank you very much for listening. This is end of chapter 7.